A black waitress walked into Charleston's most prestigious restaurant, carrying nothing but hope and her grandmother's old notebook. The wealthy owner watched her every move, cold and calculating. But when he discovered what was hidden in those worn pages, his world shattered completely. A family secret buried for decades came to light, revealing a partnership that should never have been broken. What happened next changed not just their lives, but an entire community, in ways no one could have imagined. A story of courage, redemption, and the power of truth. Prepare yourself, because this story will touch your heart and challenge everything you think you know about belonging. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video, and comment where you're watching from. She walked through the heavy oak doors of Magnolia Grace restaurant with her uniform wrinkled from nervous hands, her eyes fixed on the polished marble floor, and her shoulders carrying the weight of a silence that had followed her for 26 years. Maya Johnson had arrived nearly an hour early that Tuesday morning, not out of eagerness, but from the deep-seated fear that being late would give them one more reason to say she didn't belong. The restaurant breathed history from every corner. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over tables dressed in pristine white linens, while oil paintings of Charleston's founding families watched from gilded frames. This was the kind of place where reservations were made months in advance, where senators dined alongside old money families, and where the staff moved with the practiced grace of ballet dancers who had been performing the same routine for decades. Maya clutched her small notebook, the one her grandmother had given her years ago, its leather cover worn smooth by countless nervous fingers. Inside were recipes, observations, and the careful notes she took about everything, a habit that had helped her survive in a world that often overlooked people who looked like her. The other staff members glanced her way with expressions that ranged from curious to coldly dismissive. She had been hired during the lunch rush on a Friday when 2 waitresses had called in sick, and the manager, desperate and overwhelmed, had barely looked at her before saying she could start Monday. Now, as she stood in the pristine dining room, Maya wondered if that desperation had worn off. The head waitress, a thin woman named Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, who had worked at Magnolia Grace for 15 years, approached with the measured steps of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. "You must be the new girl," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice carrying the practiced politeness that Southern women wielded like a weapon. "I'm Mrs. Caldwell. I run the front of house here, and I expect things done a certain way." Maya nodded, her voice barely above a whisper when she replied that she was ready to learn. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes swept over her like she was taking inventory, pausing on the notebook in Maya's hands. "What's that for?" Mrs. Caldwell asked. "I like to write things down," Maya said, "so I don't forget." Mrs. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, I suppose that's practical. Come along then. I'll show you the sections." As they walked through the dining room, Maya felt the weight of watching eyes. The busboys, all young men who had grown up in Charleston's working-class neighborhoods, nodded politely but kept their distance. The other waitresses, women who had perfected the art of sweet smiles and subtle exclusion, whispered among themselves as she passed. The kitchen was a world unto itself, all stainless steel and controlled chaos. The head chef, a burly man named Tommy Rodriguez, who had worked his way up from dishwasher, looked up from his prep work and gave Maya a nod that felt more genuine than anything she had received so far. "New girl, huh?" Tommy said, wiping his hands on his apron. "You ever worked fine dining before?" "Some," Maya said, though the truth was she had spent the last 3 years waiting tables at a diner on the outskirts of town, where the most expensive item on the menu was a $12 steak dinner. Tommy seemed to sense her nervousness. "Don't let them intimidate you," he said quietly. "Food is food, and people are people. Just remember that." Maya spent her first morning following Mrs. Caldwell around like a shadow, learning the intricate dance of service that kept Magnolia Grace running smoothly. There were specific ways to hold the water pitcher, exact angles for placing bread plates, and a complex hierarchy that determined who served which tables. "The owner, Mr. Blackwood, has very particular standards," Mrs. Caldwell explained as they polished silverware. "He's been running this place for 20 years, ever since his mother passed. She opened Magnolia Grace in 1952, and he's maintained every tradition she established." Maya had heard of James Blackwood but had never seen him. He was something of a legend in Charleston's restaurant scene, known for his exacting standards and the way he had transformed his mother's small tea room into one of the city's most prestigious dining establishments. People said he was brilliant but cold, the kind of man who noticed everything but spoke to almost no one. Her first real test came during the lunch service. Maya had been assigned to a section of 4 tables, all of them occupied by what Mrs. Caldwell called regulars. People who had been coming to Magnolia Grace for years and expected to be treated like family. At table 12 sat Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a woman in her 70s who wore pearls even to lunch and had very specific opinions about how her iced tea should be served. Maya approached the table with practiced calm, though her heart was racing. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," Maya said, remembering the name from Mrs. Caldwell's briefing. "May I start you with some water?" Mrs. Whitmore looked up from her menu, and Maya saw something flicker in her eyes, a moment of hesitation that felt like a door closing. The older woman glanced around the dining room as if searching for someone else, anyone else, to take her order. "I suppose," Mrs. Whitmore said finally, her voice carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. Maya poured the water with steady hands, though she could feel every eye in the nearby tables watching her. She had experienced this before, the way some people looked right through her as if she were invisible, or worse, as if her presence somehow diminished the quality of their experience. By the time she reached her 4th table, word had spread. Maya could hear the whispers, see the way conversations stopped when she approached. The hostess, a young woman named Jennifer who had graduated from the College of Charleston the year before, began seating new arrivals anywhere but in Maya's section. "She doesn't quite fit the atmosphere we're trying to maintain," Maya overheard Jennifer telling Mrs. Caldwell during a quiet moment between lunch and dinner service. The words hit Maya like a physical blow, though she had heard variations of them her entire life. She doesn't fit. She doesn't belong. She doesn't match what we're looking for. Always the same message, wrapped in polite language that made it impossible to challenge without seeming unreasonable. Maya retreated to the small break room behind the kitchen, where the staff kept their personal belongings. She sat on a plastic chair and opened her notebook, not to write anything specific, but just to feel the familiar comfort of its pages. Her grandmother had carried a similar notebook when she worked as a seamstress for wealthy families in the 1960s, writing down measurements and fabric preferences and the small observations that helped her navigate a world that rarely acknowledged her existence. "Taking notes on your first day?" Maya looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, and her breath caught. James Blackwood was not what she had expected. He was younger than she had imagined, probably in his early 40s, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a simple white shirt and dark slacks, but something about the way he carried himself spoke of authority and complete confidence in his domain. "I'm sorry," Maya said, starting to close the notebook. "Don't apologize," he said, stepping into the room. "I'm curious about what you write." Maya felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with being caught taking a break. "Just things I notice," she said. "Ways to remember what people like, how they want things done." James Blackwood studied her face for a long moment. "And what have you noticed today?" The question felt like a test, though Maya couldn't tell what the right answer might be. She thought about Mrs. Whitmore's hesitation, about Jennifer's comment, about the way the other staff members had begun treating her like a temporary inconvenience. "I've noticed that people have very specific expectations," she said carefully, "and that meeting those expectations is more complicated than just getting the order right." Something shifted in James Blackwood's expression, a flicker of what might have been approval. "That's a wise observation," he said. "Most people never realize that." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Johnson, isn't it?" Maya nodded, surprised that he knew her name. "I'll be watching how you handle those expectations," he said. "This place has a way of revealing people's true character, both the staff and the customers." After he left, Maya sat alone in the break room trying to process what had just happened. She had expected many things from her first day at Magnolia Grace, but a conversation with the legendary James Blackwood had not been one of them. The afternoon service brought new challenges. Maya's section remained mysteriously light on customers, while the other waitresses handled full tables. She used the slower pace to study the restaurant's rhythms, watching how the experienced staff anticipated needs and moved with choreographed precision. During a quiet moment, she noticed Mrs. Caldwell speaking in hushed tones with 2 of the other waitresses near the service station. Maya couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the body language, the way the 3 women leaned in like conspirators sharing secrets. "Maya," Tommy's voice called from the kitchen pass. "Can you help me with something?" She found the chef arranging garnishes on a series of plates, each one a small work of art. "I heard your first day isn't going so smooth," he said without looking up from his work. Maya didn't know how to respond. Complaining about the other staff would sound like making excuses, but pretending everything was fine felt dishonest. "It's challenging," she said finally. Tommy glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Listen, this place has history, not all of it good. Mrs. Blackwood, the original owner, she was different. Progressive for her time, you might say. But when she died and James took over, well, some of the old attitudes came back with the old staff." "What kind of attitudes?" Maya asked, though she thought she already knew. "The kind that think there's a certain type of person who belongs in a place like this," Tommy said. "And a certain type who doesn't." Maya felt her stomach tighten. "So you're saying I should look for another job?" "I'm saying you should decide what you're willing to fight for," Tommy said. "Because working here, being good at it, that's going to be a fight whether you want it to be or not." The dinner service began with the usual pre-meal meeting, where Mrs. Caldwell reviewed the evening specials and made announcements about VIP guests and special dietary requirements. Maya stood at the back of the group, listening carefully and taking notes in her little book. "And remember," Mrs. Caldwell concluded, "we maintain the standards that have made Magnolia Grace what it is. Every interaction, every detail, reflects on our reputation." As the staff dispersed to their stations, Maya caught sight of James Blackwood watching from the kitchen doorway. Their eyes met for just a moment before he disappeared back into his office. Maya's evening section was busier than lunch had been, with 3 tables of guests who seemed more interested in good food than scrutinizing their server. She found her rhythm, moving smoothly between the kitchen and dining room, anticipating needs and providing the kind of attentive but unobtrusive service that Magnolia Grace was known for. At table 18, a young couple was celebrating their anniversary. Maya noticed that the woman kept glancing at the dessert menu, though they had both claimed to be too full for dessert when she asked earlier. "Excuse me," Maya said quietly when she returned to refill their wine glasses. "The chocolate soufflé is exceptional here, and it takes about 20 minutes to prepare. If you'd like to order it now, it could be ready by the time you're ready for dessert." The woman's face lit up. "That's perfect. We were hoping to linger over coffee." As Maya put in the dessert order, she felt a warm satisfaction that had nothing to do with the tip she might receive. This was why she had chosen restaurant work, despite all its challenges. There was something beautiful about creating moments of happiness for strangers, about being part of celebrations and special occasions. The feeling didn't last long. As she returned from the kitchen, Maya overheard Mrs. Caldwell speaking to Jennifer at the hostess station. "I've had 3 different guests ask me about the new server," Mrs. Caldwell was saying. "They want to know if this is a permanent change to our staff." "What did you tell them?" Jennifer asked. "That we're always evaluating our team to ensure we maintain the highest standards," Mrs. Caldwell replied. "I think they understood my meaning." Maya felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. She wanted to confront Mrs. Caldwell, to demand to know exactly what standards she was failing to meet, but she knew that would only confirm whatever negative assumptions had already been made about her. Instead, she returned to her tables, focusing on providing the best service she could manage. She memorized orders without writing them down, anticipated needs before guests realized they had them, and moved through the dining room with quiet efficiency. Near the end of the evening, as Maya was clearing the last table in her section, she noticed James Blackwood emerge from his office and begin his nightly walk through the restaurant. She had heard about this ritual from the other staff, how he checked every detail before closing, noting anything that needed attention. He paused at table 18, where the anniversary couple was finishing their soufflé. "How was everything this evening?" he asked in the warm but professional tone Maya had heard him use with important guests. "Absolutely wonderful," the woman replied. "Our server was exceptional. She suggested the soufflé at just the right moment, and she made our anniversary feel really special." Maya felt a flutter of pride, followed immediately by anxiety. She could see Mrs. Caldwell watching from across the room, her expression unreadable. James Blackwood's eyes found Maya as she folded napkins at a nearby table. "I'm glad to hear that," he said to the couple, but his gaze remained on Maya. "We take great pride in our service here." After the last guest had left, and the dining room was reset for the next day, Maya gathered her things from the break room. Her feet ached, and she was emotionally exhausted from a day of navigating undercurrents she didn't fully understand. As she headed toward the back exit, she nearly collided with James Blackwood in the narrow hallway. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "how do you feel your first day went?" Maya considered giving him the polite, non-committal answer that would be safest. Instead, she found herself being honest. "I think I did good work," she said. But I also think some people have already decided I don't belong here. James studied her face in the dim hallway light. And what do you think? I think I belong anywhere I can do good work and treat people with respect, Maya said, surprised by her own boldness. A small smile touched the corners of James's mouth. That's exactly what my mother used to say. He started to walk away, then turned back. Mrs. Johnson, would you be interested in coming in an hour early tomorrow? I have some things I'd like to show you. Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Good, he said. And bring that notebook of yours. I have a feeling you'll want to take notes. That night, Maya lay awake in her small apartment, replaying every moment of her first day at Magnolia Grace. She thought about Mrs. Whitmore's hesitation, about Mrs. Caldwell's whispered conversations, about Tommy's warning that working there would be a fight. But she also thought about the anniversary couple's smiles, about James Blackwood's unexpected interest in her notebook, and about the way he had mentioned his mother with something that sounded almost like grief. Maya pulled her grandmother's old notebook from her purse and opened it to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date and the words, "First day at Magnolia Grace." Below that, she began recording her observations, not just about the job itself, but about the complex web of relationships and expectations that would determine whether she survived in this world. As she wrote, Maya thought about her grandmother, who had worked for wealthy families during an era when the color of her skin had determined not just where she could work, but how she could move through the world. Her grandmother had survived by being exceptional at what she did, by making herself indispensable through skill and grace, and an unwavering commitment to dignity. Maya closed the notebook and turned off the light, but sleep didn't come easily. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and her ability to navigate a workplace where her very presence seemed to disturb the established order. But it would also bring the mysterious early meeting with James Blackwood, and Maya found herself curious about what he wanted to show her. Something told her that her story at Magnolia Grace was just beginning, and that the real test would be not just whether she could do the job, but whether she could change minds that had been made up long before she walked through those heavy oak doors. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, typical Charleston weather for late October. Maya arrived at Magnolia Grace an hour before her scheduled shift, as James Blackwood had requested. The restaurant felt different in the early morning quiet, less imposing, and more like a sleeping giant waiting to come to life. She found James in his office, a small room behind the kitchen that was crammed with filing cabinets, framed photographs, and stacks of papers that seemed to represent decades of restaurant operations. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. "Thank you for coming early," he said, standing and gesturing for her to take a seat in the chair across from his desk. "I wanted to talk to you before the chaos of service begins." Maya sat down, her notebook clutched in her hands, and waited for him to continue. "I've been running this restaurant for 20 years, James said, settling back into his chair. "And in that time, I've hired hundreds of people. Most of them were competent, some were exceptional, and a few were completely wrong for this place." Maya felt her heart sink, wondering if this was leading to her termination after just one day. "But very rarely," James continued, "I meet someone who sees things differently. Someone who notices details that others miss, who cares about the work in a way that can't be taught." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Yesterday, you made Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter feel welcome during what was clearly a difficult family lunch. You suggested the perfect wine pairing for Mr. Chen without being asked, and you handled Mrs. Whitmore's particular requirements with more grace than she deserved." Maya blinked in surprise. She hadn't realized he had been watching so closely. "The thing is," James said, "this restaurant has always been more than just a place to eat. My mother founded it with a vision of what hospitality could be when it's done right. But over the years, especially since I took over, we've lost some of that vision." He stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder thick with old papers and photographs. "I want to show you something." James spread the contents of the folder across his desk. Maya saw black and white photographs of the restaurant from its early days, newspaper clippings, and what looked like personal correspondence. "This is from 1952, the year my mother opened Magnolia Grace," he said, pointing to a photograph of the dining room. "Look closely at the staff." Maya studied the image and felt her breath catch. The staff in the photograph was racially integrated, with black and white servers working side by side, all wearing the same crisp uniforms and professional smiles. "My mother believed that good service came from good people, regardless of what they looked like," James said. "It was controversial at the time, to put it mildly." She lost customers, faced protests, even received death threats. He pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local Restaurant Breaks Color Barrier." But she also gained something more valuable, James continued. She built a reputation for excellence that had nothing to do with exclusion, and everything to do with treating every guest and every employee with respect. Maya stared at the photographs, seeing a version of Magnolia Grace that felt both foreign and familiar. "What happened?" she asked quietly. James's expression darkened. "My mother got sick in the early 70s. I was young, fresh out of college, and I didn't have her strength or her vision. I let the staff convince me that we needed to modernize our approach to stay competitive." "Modernize," Maya repeated, understanding the euphemism. "I let fear guide my decisions instead of principle," James said. And gradually, the staff became more homogeneous. The culture shifted. By the time I realized what we had lost, it seemed too late to change back. Maya looked up from the photographs to find James watching her intently. "Until yesterday," he said. "When I watched you work, I remembered what my mother used to tell me about great service. She said it came from people who understood that hospitality was about making others feel valued and welcome, not about maintaining artificial barriers." Maya felt overwhelmed by the weight of what he was sharing with her. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking of me." "I'm not asking anything," he said. "I'm offering something. I want to restore this restaurant to what my mother intended it to be. But I can't do it alone. And I can't do it with people who are committed to the status quo." He gathered the photographs and papers back into the folder. "I know your first day was difficult. I know there are people here who will make your job harder than it needs to be. But I also think you have something that this place has been missing for too long." "What's that?" Maya asked. "Integrity," James said simply. "And the courage to do excellent work even when people don't want you to succeed." Maya felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She had come to Magnolia Grace looking for a job, but James Blackwood was offering her something much more significant, a chance to be part of something meaningful. "There's one more thing," James said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book that looked remarkably similar to Maya's notebook. "This belonged to my mother. She used it to record her observations about the restaurant, about the staff, about what worked and what didn't." He handed the book to Maya, who opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, recipes, staff schedules, and thoughtful notes about guests and their preferences. "I'd like you to have it," James said. "Not as a replacement for your own notebook, but as a reminder of what this place used to be, and what it could be again." Maya held the book carefully, feeling the weight of history and possibility in its worn pages. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't know if I'm ready for this kind of responsibility. Neither was I when I inherited this place," he said. "But readiness isn't something you wait for. It's something you grow into." The sound of the kitchen staff arriving interrupted their conversation. James glanced at his watch. "We should get you ready for service," he said. "But Maya, I want you to know that you have my support. Whatever challenges you face here, you don't face them alone." As Maya left his office, carrying both her grandmother's notebook and the one that had belonged to James's mother, she felt a strange mixture of excitement and terror. She had wanted to prove herself worthy of a job at Charleston's most prestigious restaurant. Now she found herself holding the possibility of helping to restore its lost soul. The morning prep period was busy, but less tense than her first day had been. Tommy greeted her with a warm smile and showed her how to fold the cloth napkins in the specific style that Magnolia Grace required. The busboys, perhaps sensing that she had been accepted by the management, began including her in their easy banter. But Maya could also feel the undercurrents of resistance. Mrs. Caldwell watched her with sharp eyes, looking for mistakes or signs of favoritism. Jennifer, the hostess, continued to seat guests in patterns that minimized Maya's section, and the other waitresses maintained their polite but chilly distance. During the lunch service, Maya put into practice everything she had learned the day before. She paid attention to the subtle signals that indicated when guests were ready to order, when they wanted to be left alone, and when they needed gentle guidance through the menu. At table 10, she served an elderly man who seemed uncomfortable with the formal atmosphere of the restaurant. Maya noticed that he kept glancing around nervously and barely touched his soup. "Is everything all right with your meal, sir?" she asked quietly. "Oh, it's fine," he said quickly. "It's just, well, my daughter insisted on bringing me here for my birthday, but I'm more of a meat and potatoes kind of fellow. I don't really understand all these fancy names on the menu." Maya smiled warmly. Would you like me to translate some of the options into regular English? Our chef makes an excellent pot roast, though we call it braised beef short ribs with root vegetables on the menu. The man's face brightened considerably. Now that sounds like something I'd enjoy. Maya spent a few minutes explaining the menu in terms the gentleman could relate to, and by the end of the meal, he was laughing and telling her stories about his 40 years working as a mechanic. When he left, he pressed a generous tip into her hand and said she had made his birthday special. James Blackwood, who had been observing from across the dining room, caught Maya's eye and nodded approvingly. But not everyone was pleased with Maya's growing confidence. As she was refilling water glasses during a quiet moment in the afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell approached her with the expression of someone about to deliver unpleasant news. "Maya, I need to speak with you about your service style," Mrs. Caldwell said in a voice that carried just far enough to be overheard by nearby staff. "Of course," Maya replied, setting down the water pitcher. "I've observed that you're spending quite a bit of time chatting with guests," Mrs. Caldwell said. "While friendliness is certainly appreciated, we maintain a certain level of professional distance here. Our guests expect refined service, not casual conversation." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had been providing exactly the kind of personalized attention that made guests feel special, but Mrs. Caldwell was making it sound like a character flaw. "I understand," Maya said carefully. "I was just trying to make sure the guests felt comfortable." "Yes. Well, comfort can be achieved without oversharing or creating inappropriate familiarity," Mrs. Caldwell said. "I trust you'll adjust your approach accordingly." As Mrs. Caldwell walked away, Maya noticed that several of the other staff members had been listening. Some looked embarrassed on her behalf, while others seemed satisfied that she was being put in her place. Maya returned to her work, but the criticism stung more than she wanted to admit. She had thought she was doing well, but Mrs. Caldwell's words made her second-guess every interaction with guests. During the dinner service, Maya found herself holding back, providing competent but impersonal service that felt wrong but safe. She could see the confusion in some guests' faces when she failed to provide the warm attention they had received at lunch, but she was afraid to risk another public correction. Near the end of the evening, as Maya was finishing the side work required at the end of each shift, James Blackwood appeared at her station. "How did the rest of your day go?" he asked. Maya hesitated, not wanting to complain but also not wanting to lie. "It was educational," she said finally. James studied her face, seeming to sense that something had changed since their morning conversation. "Maya, can I give you some advice?" She nodded. "Excellence is often threatening to people who are comfortable with mediocrity," he said quietly. "When you're doing something well, especially if you're doing it differently than it's been done before, there will always be people who try to convince you that you're doing it wrong." He glanced around the dining room, which was emptying as the last guests finished their meals. "My mother used to say that the measure of a restaurant wasn't the perfection of its protocol, but the happiness of its guests," James continued. "Protocol serves the guest experience, not the other way around." Maya felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease. "So you think it's okay to talk with guests?" "I think it's essential," James said. "Hospitality isn't about maintaining distance. It's about creating connection. The guests who've been coming here for years don't return because of our tablecloth thread count. They return because someone makes them feel welcome and valued." As Maya gathered her things at the end of her shift, she reflected on the conflicting messages she was receiving. James Blackwood wanted her to be herself, to bring her natural warmth and intuition to the job. But Mrs. Caldwell seemed determined to reshape her into something more conventional, more in line with whatever image the restaurant was supposed to project. Walking to her car in the employee parking lot, Maya pulled out her grandmother's notebook and wrote a single line. "Sometimes doing the right thing means choosing which rules to follow and which ones to break." She didn't know it yet, but that lesson would become more important than she could imagine in the weeks to come. The third week at Magnolia Grace brought an unexpected shift in the restaurant's rhythm. Charleston's social season was beginning, which meant private parties, business dinners, and the kind of high-stakes service that could make or break careers in the hospitality industry. Maya had settled into a routine that balanced James Blackwood's encouragement with Mrs. Caldwell's increasingly watchful oversight. She had learned to read the dining room like a map, understanding which guests wanted conversation and which preferred invisible efficiency. Her notebook had grown thick with observations about regulars' preferences, dietary restrictions, and the small personal details that transformed good service into memorable experiences. But with the increased business came increased scrutiny. Maya could feel eyes on her constantly. waiting for mistakes that could justify the whispered complaints about her presence. She had overheard Mrs. Caldwell on the phone with what sounded like other restaurant managers, asking pointed questions about hiring practices and staff turnover. The tension came to a head on a busy Thursday evening when the Honorable Judge William Crawford hosted a dinner party for 8 in Magnolia Grace's private dining room. Judge Crawford was one of Charleston's most influential figures, a man whose approval could make a restaurant's reputation and whose displeasure could destroy it. Maya had been assigned to serve the private party, a decision that had caused visible consternation among the senior staff. She could see Mrs. Caldwell's jaw tighten when James personally confirmed the assignment, and the other waitresses exchanged meaningful glances that spoke volumes about their expectations for the evening. "This is a very important event," Mrs. Caldwell told Maya as they reviewed the evening's preparations. "Judge Crawford has very specific expectations, and his guests are equally discerning. There's no room for error tonight." Maya nodded, understanding the subtext. This was a test, and failure would provide all the justification needed to reshape her role at the restaurant or eliminate it entirely. The private dining room was Magnolia Grace's crown jewel, with hand-painted wallpaper, a crystal chandelier that had been imported from Vienna, and a mahogany table that could seat 12 comfortably. Tonight, it was set for 8, with the restaurant's finest china, silver, and crystal. Maya arrived early to familiarize herself with the room's layout and review the evening's menu. She was studying the wine pairings when she heard voices approaching the room. "I specifically requested our most experienced server," Judge Crawford was saying to someone, presumably James. "This dinner is extremely important to my career, and I can't afford any complications." Maya's heart sank as she realized what the judge was really saying. She considered slipping out through the service entrance, sparing everyone the uncomfortable confrontation that was clearly coming. But something in her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, reminding her that running away never solved anything. James's response was calm but firm. "Judge Crawford, I can assure you that Mrs. Johnson is exceptionally qualified to handle your party. She's been providing outstanding service since she joined our team. I'm sure she's adequate," the judge replied, his tone suggesting anything but confidence. "But perhaps it would be better to have someone more familiar with the expectations of my guests." Maya stepped forward before James could respond, drawing herself up to her full height and meeting Judge Crawford's surprised gaze directly. "Good evening, Your Honor," she said with the warm professionalism she had perfected over weeks of practice. "I'm Maya Johnson, and I'll be taking care of your party tonight. I've reviewed your preferences from your previous visits, and I'm confident we can provide exactly the experience you're hoping for." Judge Crawford studied her face for a long moment, clearly trying to determine how to respond to her direct approach. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "Very well. I trust you understand the importance of this evening." "I do," Maya said simply. "And I won't let you down." As the judge moved into the dining room to inspect the table settings, James caught Maya's eye. There was something in his expression that looked like pride mixed with concern. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "No," Maya admitted, "but I'm sure about doing my job well, regardless of who's watching." The dinner party began promptly at 7, with Judge Crawford's guests arriving in a parade of expensive cars and designer clothing. Maya recognized some faces from the society pages of the Charleston Post and Courier. Successful attorneys, prominent business people, and their elegantly dressed wives. From the moment she took the first drink orders, Maya could feel the weight of expectations in the room. Every movement was scrutinized, every word analyzed for signs of inadequacy or unfamiliarity with the social codes that governed Charleston's elite circles. But Maya had learned something important during her weeks at Magnolia Grace. Excellent service was universal. The skills that made a mechanic feel welcome on his birthday were the same ones that could impress a table full of judges and socialites. It was about paying attention, anticipating needs, and treating every guest with genuine respect. She moved through the evening with quiet confidence, explaining the chef's preparations with knowledge gained from her careful study of the menu, suggesting wine pairings with authority earned through tastings with Tommy, and managing the complex choreography of formal service with the grace her grandmother had taught her came from taking pride in one's work. By the time the main course was served, Maya could see the guests relaxing. Conversations flowed more freely, laughter became more genuine, and several people complimented the food and service. Judge Crawford, who had been watching her like a hawk during the first course, began to participate more naturally in the dinner conversation. The evening's true test came during dessert service, when one of the guests, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrington, began choking on a piece of the chocolate tart. Maya reacted instantly, moving behind the woman's chair and performing the Heimlich maneuver with the calm efficiency of someone who had taken first aid training seriously. The offending piece of tart dislodged quickly, and Mrs. Harrington recovered without incident, but the moment had transformed the entire dynamic of the room. Maya had stopped being the server they were evaluating and had become the person who had potentially saved a life. "Where did you learn to do that?" Judge Crawford asked as Maya helped Mrs. Harrington sip water and regain her composure. "I take first aid classes every year," Maya said simply. "I figure if I'm responsible for people's safety while they're eating, I should know how to help if something goes wrong." Judge Crawford nodded slowly, and Maya could see something shifting in his expression. "That's very thoughtful preparation." The rest of the evening proceeded smoothly, with the guests treating Maya with a warmth and respect that had been notably absent at the beginning of the night. When Judge Crawford settled the bill, he included a tip that was generous even by Magnolia Grace's standards. But more importantly, as the guests were leaving, Judge Crawford pulled Maya aside. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions tonight that were unfair and inappropriate. You provided exceptional service, and you handled that emergency with more grace under pressure than I've seen from people with decades more experience." Maya felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means a great deal to me. I hope you'll continue to serve our future events," he said. "And I'll be sure to request you specifically." After the last guest had departed and Maya had finished cleaning the private dining room, she found James waiting for her in his office. "I heard about what happened with Mrs. Harrington," he said. "Quick thinking." "Just doing my job," Maya replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "That was more than just doing your job," James said. "That was taking responsibility for the complete well-being of your guests. It's exactly the kind of service my mother would have been proud of." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Maya, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the restaurant's history. There's something else I'd like to share with you, but it requires a level of trust between us." Maya felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of trust?" "The kind that comes with knowing someone's character," James said. "Tonight, you showed me yours, and I think it's time I showed you mine." He stood and walked to a different filing cabinet, one that Maya noticed was locked with a small key he kept on his keychain. From it, he withdrew a folder that looked older and more worn than the materials he had shown her before. "These are documents that I've never shared with anyone," he said, returning to his seat. "They're about the circumstances surrounding my mother's death, and some decisions she made in her final years that I didn't understand until recently." James opened the folder and spread its contents on the desk. Maya saw legal documents, handwritten letters, and photographs that seemed to tell a story she couldn't yet comprehend. "My mother died in 1979, James said quietly. "But what I didn't know until I was going through her personal papers last year was that she had been planning to sell the restaurant before she got sick." Maya looked up from the documents, confused. "Sell it? But I thought you inherited it." "I did inherit it," James said, "but not in the way I always believed. It turns out my mother had entered into a partnership agreement with someone else. Someone who had been helping to finance the restaurant's operations during some difficult years in the early 70s. He pulled out a legal document that was dense with official language and pointed to a section that had been highlighted in yellow. "According to this contract, if my mother died before the partnership could be fully established, her partner would have the right to purchase the restaurant at a predetermined price. If her partner died first, my mother would retain full ownership." Maya studied the document, trying to understand its implications. "What happened to the partner?" "That's where the story gets complicated," James said. "The partner's name was Louise Washington. She was a woman who had worked here as a cook in the early days, but she had also been investing money back into the restaurant and helping my mother navigate some of the financial challenges that came with being progressive in her hiring practices." Maya felt a strange chill run down her spine. Washington had been her grandmother's maiden name, though she had taken her husband's name when she married. "My mother's letters suggest that Louise Washington disappeared sometime in 1978, James continued. "There was no explanation, no goodbye, just gone. My mother was devastated, not just personally but financially. Without Louise's partnership, she struggled to keep the restaurant afloat." James pulled out a handwritten letter that was clearly from his mother, based on the delicate script and personal tone. "In this letter to her attorney, my mother writes about trying to locate Louise Washington to honor their partnership agreement. She felt guilty about retaining full ownership when Louise had contributed so much to the restaurant's success. Maya's hands were trembling as she reached for the letter. As she read her mother's careful handwriting, one sentence seemed to leap off the page. Louise Washington was more than a business partner. She was the heart of this place, the person who reminded me every day that hospitality was about love, not luxury. "Mr. Blackwood," Maya said quietly. "What was Louise Washington's married name?" James consulted another document. "According to the records I found, she married someone named Robert Johnson in 1955. The room seemed to spin around Maya as the pieces clicked into place. Louise Washington Johnson, her grandmother's full name. The woman who had carried a notebook filled with recipes and observations. The seamstress who had worked for wealthy families and disappeared from family history without explanation. "James," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think Louise Washington Johnson was my grandmother." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of revelation and the sudden understanding that their connection ran deeper than either of them had imagined. James stared at Maya with an expression that mixed shock with something that looked almost like relief. "Your grandmother," he repeated slowly. That would mean my family has a connection to this place that goes back generations," Maya finished. "And that my being here isn't coincidence." James leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair as he processed this information. "Maya, if what you're saying is true, then according to the partnership agreement, your family would have had a legitimate claim to partial ownership of this restaurant." Maya felt overwhelmed by the implications. She had come to Magnolia Grace looking for a job, only to discover that her grandmother had been one of its founders. The notebook she carried, the recipes she had inherited, the instincts that had made her good at hospitality work. All of it suddenly made sense in a way that felt almost mystical. "What happened to her?" Maya asked. "Why did she disappear?" "I don't know," James admitted. "But I think we need to find out. Because if your grandmother was Louise Washington, then you're not just an employee here. You're family." As Maya walked to her car that night, her mind raced with questions and possibilities. She thought about her grandmother's stories, the ones that had always seemed incomplete, the way certain years of her life had been glossed over with vague references to difficult times and changes in circumstances. Now, Maya wondered if those difficult times had included the heartbreak of losing a partnership that represented more than just business, the pain of leaving behind a place and people she loved for reasons that remained mysterious. The next morning, Maya arrived at work to find that news of Judge Crawford's dinner party had spread throughout the restaurant. Tommy greeted her with a broad grin and a knowing nod, while several of the busboys offered congratulations on what they had heard was an exceptional evening. But Maya also noticed increased tension from Mrs. Caldwell and the other senior staff. Success, it seemed, was almost more threatening than failure, because it made her harder to dismiss. During the morning prep period, Mrs. Caldwell called a staff meeting that Maya sensed was really about her, though her name was never mentioned directly. "As we move into the busy season," Mrs. Caldwell announced to the assembled staff, "it's important that we maintain the standards and traditions that have made Magnolia Grace what it is. Change for the sake of change can be disruptive to the culture we've worked so hard to build." The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was clear. Some changes were acceptable, and others were not. After the meeting, Maya found herself alone in the break room with Jennifer, the hostess who had been consistently seating guests away from her section. "Maya," Jennifer said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Maya nodded, curious about what had prompted this unexpected conversation. "How do you handle it?" Jennifer asked. "The way some people look at you? The comments they make when they think you can't hear? Doesn't it bother you?" The question caught Maya off guard. She had expected hostility from Jennifer, not vulnerability. "It bothers me," Maya said honestly. "But I've learned that I can't control what other people think or say. I can only control how well I do my job and how I treat people." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, seeming to struggle with something. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "about the way I've been seating your section. Mrs. Caldwell asked me to manage guest comfort levels. But after hearing about last night, I realized I was wrong." Maya felt a small surge of hope. Perhaps change was possible, one person at a time. "Thank you for telling me," Maya said, "and for the apology. That takes courage." As the lunch service began, Maya noticed a subtle shift in the restaurant's dynamics. Her section was fuller than it had been in weeks, and several guests specifically asked to be seated at her tables. Word of her handling of Judge Crawford's dinner party had apparently spread beyond the restaurant walls, but with increased visibility came increased pressure. Maya could feel Mrs. Caldwell watching her more closely than ever, looking for any sign of the pride or carelessness that success sometimes brought. During a quiet moment between lunch and dinner, Maya retreated to James's office to continue their conversation from the night before. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she said. "About my grandmother and the partnership. I'd like to know more about what happened to her." James nodded. "I've been thinking about it too. I have some contacts who might be able to help us research the situation. But Maya, I need you to understand that this information could change everything about your position here." "What do you mean?" Maya asked. "I mean that if your grandmother was indeed Louise Washington, and if the partnership agreement is still legally valid, then you might have a legitimate claim to partial ownership of this restaurant," James said. "That would make you more than an employee. It would make you a stakeholder." Maya felt her head spinning at the implications. "But I don't want to take anything that isn't rightfully mine. I just want to understand what happened to my family. And I want to understand what happened to my mother's partner and friend," James said. "I think we both deserve to know the truth, regardless of what it means for the business." That evening, Maya called her mother from her apartment, something she rarely did because their relationship had been strained for years. But the revelations about her grandmother had made her desperate for more information about family history that had always seemed deliberately obscured. "Mama," Maya said when her mother answered the phone, "I need to ask you about Grandma Louise." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What about her?" her mother asked carefully. "Tell me about her work. I know she was a seamstress, but did she ever work in restaurants? Did she ever mention a place called Magnolia Grace?" Another pause, longer this time. "Maya, why are you asking about this now?" "Because I'm working there," Maya said. "And I think there might be a connection between Grandma and this place." Maya's mother was quiet for so long that Maya wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, she spoke in a voice that sounded years older than it had moments before. "Your grandmother never talked about those years," her mother said. "But I remember her crying sometimes when she thought no one was looking. And I remember her saying that she had left something important behind. Something that wasn't hers to take but that she regretted losing." "What kind of something?" Maya asked. "I don't know," her mother replied. "But Maya, if you've found whatever it was she lost, maybe it's time for our family to stop running from the past." As Maya hung up the phone, she felt the weight of generations of unfinished business settling on her shoulders. She was no longer just a waitress trying to prove herself worthy of a job. She was a granddaughter seeking to understand a legacy that had been hidden from her, and a woman standing at the intersection of past and future. The next few days passed in a blur of excellent service and growing confidence. Maya's reputation in Charleston's dining community was spreading, and she began to see familiar faces returning specifically to sit in her section. Judge Crawford had apparently been true to his word about requesting her for future events, but Maya also sensed that her success was creating fault lines within the restaurant's established hierarchy. Mrs. Caldwell's criticisms became more frequent and more pointed. The other waitresses began to whisper about favoritism and special treatment, and Maya started to notice small acts of sabotage. Missing silverware that forced her to run to the kitchen during busy periods, incorrect information about table modifications that made her look unprepared, and scheduling changes that were somehow never communicated to her. The situation came to a head on a particularly busy Friday night, when Maya was assigned to handle a corporate dinner for 12 executives from a prominent Charleston law firm. The dinner was important not just for the restaurant's reputation, but for Maya personally, as several of the guests were people she had served before who had specifically requested her. Everything was going smoothly until the main course service, when Maya discovered that the kitchen had prepared only 10 entrees instead of 12. When she asked Tommy about the missing plates, he looked confused and showed her the order ticket, which clearly indicated 12 meals. "Someone changed this," Tommy said, pointing to what looked like an erasure on the ticket. "This originally said 12, but somebody made it look like 10. Maya felt her stomach drop as she realized what had happened. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the order to make her look incompetent in front of important guests. With only minutes before the delay would become embarrassingly obvious, Maya made a quick decision. She approached the table and explained the situation with honest directness. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to apologize for a delay with 2 of your entrees. There was an error in the kitchen communication, and it will take about 10 minutes to prepare the missing dishes. In the meantime, please allow me to bring you some additional appetizers compliments of the house." Instead of anger, Maya's honesty was met with understanding and even appreciation for her direct approach. The executives used the extra time for conversation and networking, and by the time all the entrees had been served, the evening had actually improved rather than being ruined. But Maya knew that the sabotage had been intentional, and she knew that it would likely escalate unless she addressed it directly. After service, she found Mrs. Caldwell in the office completing the evening's paperwork. "We need to talk," Maya said, closing the door behind her. "Mrs. Caldwell looked up with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation. "About what?" "About the order ticket that was altered tonight," Maya said. "About the missing silverware yesterday. About the schedule changes that somehow never reach me." Mrs. Caldwell's face remained carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Maya said. "I'm stating directly that someone is trying to sabotage my work, and I think you know who it is." For a moment, Mrs. Caldwell's mask slipped, and Maya saw something that looked almost like desperation underneath the hostility. "You don't understand what you're doing to this place," Mrs. Caldwell said quietly. "Magnolia Grace has a reputation built over decades. We can't just change everything because one person thinks things should be different." Maya realized that Mrs. Caldwell's resistance wasn't just about racism, though that was certainly part of it. It was also about fear of change, fear of losing control, and fear that admitting Maya's success meant acknowledging that the old ways might not have been the best ways. "I'm not trying to change everything," Maya said. "I'm just trying to do good work and treat people with respect. If that's threatening to what this place represents, then maybe what this place represents needs to be examined." Mrs. Caldwell stared at her for a long moment, and Maya could see years of certainty crumbling behind her eyes. "You don't understand," Mrs. Caldwell said finally. "If this restaurant fails, if we lose our reputation, it's not just a business closing. It's my whole life disappearing. I've worked here for 15 years. This is all I know." For the first time, Maya felt a flicker of sympathy for the woman who had made her working life so difficult. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't just defending a job. She was defending an identity that had been built around maintaining traditions and standards that were now being questioned. "Mrs. Caldwell," Maya said gently, "good restaurants don't fail because they treat people with respect. They fail because they stop caring about their guests and their staff." As Maya left the office, she wondered if she had planted a seed of understanding or simply confirmed Mrs. Caldwell's belief that change was dangerous. Either way, she knew that the conversation had been necessary, and that whatever happened next would determine not just her future at Magnolia Grace, but the restaurant's future as well. Walking to her car that night, Maya pulled out both notebooks, her grandmother's and the one that had belonged to James's mother. She opened them side by side under a streetlight and began comparing the handwriting, looking for similarities that might confirm what she and James both suspected. The writing styles were different, but certain letter formations were remarkably similar. More importantly, several recipes appeared in both books, written in slightly different hands but with identical ingredients and techniques. Maya closed the notebooks and looked up at the stars that were barely visible through Charleston's light pollution. Somewhere in those pages was the story of two women who had worked together to build something beautiful, only to have it torn apart by circumstances that remained mysterious. But Maya was beginning to understand that their story wasn't finished. It was simply waiting for the next generation to complete what they had started, to heal what had been broken, and to prove that some legacies are strong enough to survive decades of silence and separation. As she drove home through Charleston's quiet streets, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out exactly what had happened to her grandmother and James's mother, and when she did, she was going to make sure that the partnership they had envisioned would finally become reality, regardless of who tried to stand in her way. The following Monday brought Charleston's first real cold snap of the season, and with it, a revelation that would change everything Maya thought she knew about her family's history. James had spent the weekend working with a private investigator who specialized in genealogical research, and the documents spread across his desk that morning told a story that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. "We found her," James said as Maya settled into the chair across from his desk. "Your grandmother, Louise Washington Johnson." And Maya, the story is more complicated than either of us imagined. The investigator had uncovered records showing that Louise had indeed been James's mother's business partner, but she had also been much more than that. The two women had been close friends during an era when such friendships crossed racial lines at considerable personal and professional risk. According to these documents, James continued, pointing to a folder thick with legal papers and personal correspondence, your grandmother didn't just disappear in 1978. She was forced to leave Charleston. Maya felt her heart clench. Forced how? There was a campaign of intimidation, James said quietly. Anonymous threats, vandalism at her home, pressure on her husband's employer. The investigators found police reports that were filed but never seriously pursued. James pulled out a series of photographs that showed broken windows, racist graffiti, and what looked like the aftermath of systematic harassment. Your grandmother held out as long as she could, James continued. But when the threats started including your mother, who would have been about 8 years old at the time, Louise made the decision to leave rather than put her family in danger. Maya stared at the photographs, feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak for the grandmother she had never fully understood. What about the partnership? Did she just walk away from her investment? That's where the story gets even more tragic, James said. According to these letters between my mother and her attorney, Louise signed over her partnership rights to my mother for $1, essentially giving away her stake in the restaurant to protect my mother from being targeted as well. James handed Maya a legal document that was yellowed with age, but still clearly legible. At the bottom was her grandmother's signature, firm and dignified even in the midst of what must have been devastating circumstances. But here's what my mother did that I never knew about, James said, his voice thick with emotion. She never accepted Louise's sacrifice as final. She continued to set aside half of the restaurant's profits in a separate account, intending to return Louise's investment plus interest when it became safe to do so. Maya looked up from the document, confused. What happened to that money? It's still there, James said simply. 45 years of accumulated profits, sitting in an account that my mother established in both their names. Maya, your grandmother's share of Magnolia Grace has been growing for nearly half a century. The number that James showed her was staggering, representing not just money, but a lifetime of deferred dreams and interrupted partnerships. Maya felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. James, I don't know what to say, she managed. This changes everything. It changes everything, he agreed. But Maya, I need you to understand that claiming this inheritance will not be simple. There are people who will fight it, who will argue that too much time has passed, or that the original partnership was never legally valid. As if summoned by their conversation about opposition, Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway of James's office, her face pale but determined. Mr. Blackwood, I need to speak with you, she said, her eyes flicking nervously between James and Maya. There's been a development that requires your immediate attention. James gestured for her to enter, though Maya could sense his reluctance to interrupt their conversation. What kind of development? James asked. Mrs. Caldwell straightened her shoulders as if preparing for battle. I've received a call from the Charleston Restaurant Association. They've had complaints about changes in our service standards and staff composition. They're suggesting that Magnolia Grace may be moving away from the traditions that earned us our reputation. Maya felt her stomach drop as she realized what Mrs. Caldwell was really saying. Someone had been making formal complaints about her presence at the restaurant, couching their objections in language about tradition and standards. Who made these complaints? James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. They wouldn't say specifically, Mrs. Caldwell replied, but the implication was that our recent hiring decisions may be affecting guest comfort levels and repeat business. James stood slowly, and Maya could see anger building behind his carefully controlled expression. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, are you suggesting that excellent service is somehow incompatible with our traditions? I'm suggesting that some changes happen too quickly for people to adjust to comfortably, Mrs. Caldwell replied, and that we might want to consider a more gradual approach to staff development. Maya realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for since her first day at Magnolia Grace. The subtle resistance and quiet sabotage had escalated into direct confrontation, and she could either retreat or stand her ground. Mrs. Caldwell, Maya said, rising from her chair, I understand that my presence here has been difficult for some people to accept, but I've never asked for special treatment or lower standards. I've only asked for the opportunity to do excellent work. Mrs. Caldwell turned to face Maya directly, and for the first time since they had met, her expression was more sad than hostile. This isn't about you personally, she said quietly. It's about what this restaurant represents to people who have been coming here for decades. Change is threatening, even when it's good change. Then maybe it's time for people to examine why change feels so threatening, Maya replied. And maybe it's time for Magnolia Grace to decide whether it wants to represent the past or the future. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy from the kitchen, looking uncharacteristically serious. "Boss," he said to James, "we've got a problem out front. There are protesters." Through the restaurant's front windows, Maya could see a small group of people carrying signs that were too far away to read clearly, but their message was obvious from the way they had positioned themselves directly in front of Magnolia Grace's entrance. James, Maya, and Mrs. Caldwell moved to the hostess station, where they could see the protesters more clearly. There were about a dozen people, mostly older white residents of Charleston, carrying signs with messages like, "Preserve our heritage," and "Maintain traditional standards." "How long have they been there?" James asked Jennifer, who was watching the scene with obvious distress. "About 20 minutes, Jennifer replied. "They're not blocking the entrance, but they're definitely making guests uncomfortable. I've had 3 reservation cancellations already." Maya felt a surge of guilt, knowing that her presence at the restaurant had caused this disruption. She was about to suggest that she should leave when James spoke first. "Jennifer, please call the police and ask them to ensure the protesters stay on public property and don't interfere with our guests," he said. "Mrs. Caldwell, I want you to prepare the staff for a potentially difficult service period. And Maya, I need you to stay exactly where you are." "James, maybe I should go home for today," Maya said. "I don't want to cause problems for the restaurant." "The only problem here is people who think they can intimidate us into abandoning our principles," James replied firmly. "My mother faced similar pressure when she first opened this restaurant, and she didn't back down. Neither will we." As the lunch service began despite the continued presence of protesters outside, Maya found herself serving in an atmosphere charged with tension and possibility. Some guests seemed nervous about the situation, while others appeared energized by the restaurant's refusal to be intimidated. At table 6, Maya served an elderly couple who had been coming to Magnolia Grace for over 20 years. The woman, Mrs. Elizabeth Harrison, had initially seemed uncomfortable with Maya's presence during previous visits, but today she surprised everyone. "Young lady," Mrs. Harrison said as Maya refilled her water glass, "I want you to know that my husband and I are here today specifically because of those people outside. We don't agree with what they represent, and we don't want them speaking for Charleston." Maya felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. That means more to me than I can say." "Good service is good service," Mrs. Harrison replied. "And you've been providing the best service we've experienced in years. Anyone who has a problem with that needs to examine their own heart." Similar conversations occurred throughout the lunch service, as Maya discovered that the protesters had inadvertently created a counter-movement of support. Guests who might have remained silent about their approval of the changes at Magnolia Grace were now vocal in their defense of the restaurant's new direction. By the end of the lunch period, the protesters had dwindled to just a few die-hard demonstrators, while the restaurant had served more guests than on a typical Monday. James appeared pleased, but not surprised by the outcome. "Maya," he said during the quiet period between lunch and dinner, "I think it's time we made our partnership official." Maya looked up from the silverware she was polishing, confused by the sudden shift in conversation. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean that your grandmother's investment in this restaurant was never legally terminated," James said, "and I believe it's time to restore her partnership and transfer it to you as her heir." James pulled out a set of legal documents that he had clearly been preparing for this moment. "These papers would make you a 50% owner of Magnolia Grace, as your grandmother would have been if circumstances had been different," he explained. "It's not a gift or charity. It's the restoration of something that was always rightfully yours." Maya stared at the documents, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what James was offering. "I don't know if I'm ready for this kind of responsibility," she said honestly. "I don't think anyone is ever truly ready to become a business owner," James replied. "But I think you're ready to help restore this restaurant to what it was meant to be." The decision was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Caldwell, who had obviously overheard part of their conversation. Her face was pale, but her expression was resigned rather than angry. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "if you're planning to restructure the restaurant's ownership, I think I should tender my resignation." James and Maya both looked surprised by her announcement. "Mrs. Caldwell, that's not necessary," James said. "These changes don't affect your position here." "Yes, they do," Mrs. Caldwell replied, "because they represent a direction for this restaurant that I don't think I can support. Not because it's wrong, but because I'm not capable of changing the way I think about how things should be done." Maya felt an unexpected sadness at Mrs. Caldwell's announcement. Despite their conflicts, she had respected the older woman's dedication to excellence, even when they disagreed about what excellence looked like. "Mrs. Caldwell," Maya said, "would you be willing to stay if we could find a way to preserve the traditions you value while also creating space for new approaches?" Mrs. Caldwell studied Maya's face for a long moment. "What kind of space?" "The kind where your experience and my perspective could work together instead of against each other," Maya said. "This restaurant needs both of us to be truly successful." Over the following week, Maya, James, and Mrs. Caldwell worked together to develop a new structure for Magnolia Grace that honored its history while embracing change. Mrs. Caldwell would remain as the front-of-house manager, while Maya would take on the role of partner with specific responsibility for staff development and community outreach. The legal process of transferring Louise Washington Johnson's partnership to Maya was complex but straightforward. The original documents were clear about the terms of the partnership, and the accumulated profits provided undeniable evidence of James's mother's intent to preserve Louise's stake in the restaurant. When the papers were finally signed on a cold December morning, Maya found herself the co-owner of one of Charleston's most prestigious restaurants. The irony was not lost on her that she had achieved in weeks what would have been impossible for her grandmother to maintain 45 years earlier. But ownership brought new challenges along with new opportunities. Maya discovered that running a restaurant required skills she had never developed, from managing inventory and schedules to handling vendor relationships and marketing decisions. James proved to be a patient teacher, sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over 20 years of restaurant management. But Maya also brought her own insights to the partnership, particularly regarding staff morale and guest satisfaction. "You see things I miss," James told her one evening as they reviewed the week's financial reports. "I've been so focused on maintaining standards that I forgot standards should evolve to reflect the best of what we're capable of." Maya's first major decision as co-owner was to implement a profit-sharing program for all employees, ensuring that the restaurant's success was shared with the people who made it possible. Her second decision was to establish a scholarship fund for hospitality students from underrepresented communities, creating pathways for others who might face the same barriers she had encountered. The changes at Magnolia Grace did not go unnoticed in Charleston's restaurant community. Food critics began writing about the restaurant's transformation, praising not just the continued excellence of the food and service, but the way the establishment had become a model for inclusive hospitality. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. One evening in late January, Maya was surprised to see Judge Crawford enter the restaurant with a guest she didn't immediately recognize. "Mrs. Johnson," the judge said warmly, "I'd like you to meet my colleague, Judge Patricia Williams. She's been eager to experience the service we've heard so much about." Judge Williams was an African-American woman about Maya's age, and the smile she gave Maya carried a weight of understanding that needed no explanation. "Judge Crawford has told me about your exceptional service," Judge Williams said. "But more importantly, he's told me about the courage you've shown in creating change in a place that wasn't always ready for it." As Maya served the two judges that evening, she reflected on how much had changed since her first nervous day at Magnolia Grace. She was no longer the anxious newcomer hoping to prove herself worthy of a job. She was a business owner committed to proving that excellence and inclusion were not contradictory values. The winter season brought a steady stream of new guests to Magnolia Grace, many of them drawn by word of mouth about the restaurant's transformation. Maya began to recognize faces that reflected Charleston's changing demographics, families and professionals who had previously felt unwelcome in the city's most prestigious dining establishments. But perhaps the most important change was in the staff itself. The atmosphere of tension and hierarchy that had characterized Maya's early weeks had been replaced by a sense of shared purpose and mutual respect. New employees were hired based on their skills and character, rather than their ability to fit predetermined molds, and existing staff members found themselves growing in ways they hadn't expected. Tommy was promoted to executive chef, with Maya's strong recommendation and James's enthusiastic approval. Jennifer evolved from a nervous hostess into a confident manager, who took pride in making every guest feel welcomed. Even some of the waitstaff who had initially resisted Maya's presence began to acknowledge that the restaurant's new direction was benefiting everyone. The most surprising transformation was in Mrs. Caldwell herself. Released from the pressure of defending traditions that had never really served the restaurant's best interests, she discovered a talent for training and mentoring that made her invaluable in helping new employees understand the genuine standards that made Magnolia Grace special. "I spent so much energy trying to maintain things that didn't matter," Mrs. Caldwell confided to Maya one evening, as they prepared for a particularly busy service. "I forgot that the only tradition worth preserving is treating people with respect and dignity." As spring arrived in Charleston, bringing with it the tourists and special events that marked the city's social calendar, Maya found herself facing a new kind of challenge. Success brought scrutiny, and not all of it was positive. A competing restaurant owner filed a complaint with the city, alleging that Magnolia Grace's hiring practices constituted reverse discrimination. A local newspaper ran an editorial questioning whether the restaurant's changes represented authentic progress or merely fashionable politics, and some longtime guests made it clear that they preferred the restaurant's previous incarnation. But for every critic, there seemed to be two supporters. The scholarship fund Maya had established received donations from unexpected sources, including some of Charleston's most established families. Food industry publications began featuring Magnolia Grace as an example of how restaurants could evolve while maintaining their essential character. And most importantly, the restaurant's financial performance reached levels that exceeded even James's optimistic projections. "You've done something I never thought was possible," James told Maya as they reviewed the first quarter's financial reports. "You've proven that doing the right thing and running a successful business aren't mutually exclusive." Maya smiled, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with success. "James, I keep thinking about what your mother and my grandmother might have accomplished if they had been allowed to work together without interference." "I think they'd be proud of what we've built," James replied. "But more importantly, I think they'd want us to keep building." The conversation led to Maya's most ambitious project yet, a plan to open a second location that would serve as both a restaurant and a culinary training center for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The project would require significant investment and carry considerable risk, but Maya felt it was the logical extension of everything Magnolia Grace had come to represent. The planning process for the new location brought Maya into contact with parts of Charleston's business community that she had never navigated before. She found herself in meetings with bankers, city planners, and potential investors, learning to speak the language of business development and community partnership. Some meetings went smoothly, with people who were genuinely excited about the project's potential impact. Others were more challenging, requiring Maya to defend not just the business case for the expansion, but the underlying philosophy that drove it. "Why does every restaurant project have to be about social justice?" one potential investor asked during a particularly tense meeting. "Why can't you just focus on making money?" "Because making money and making a difference aren't contradictory goals," Maya replied. "And because businesses that only focus on profit miss opportunities to create value that goes beyond financial returns." The investor ultimately declined to participate in the project, but the conversation reinforced Maya's conviction that the new location needed to be built with partners who shared her vision, rather than those who simply saw profit potential. As summer approached, Maya received an unexpected phone call that would add another layer of complexity to her story. The caller identified herself as Dr. Sarah Washington, a professor of African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. "Ms. Johnson," Dr. Washington said, "I've been researching my family's genealogy, and I believe your grandmother Louise Washington Johnson may have been my great-aunt. I'd very much like to meet with you to share what I've learned about our family's history." The meeting with Dr. Washington took place on a quiet Sunday afternoon at Magnolia Grace, with James present as well. Dr. Washington brought with her a collection of documents, photographs, and family stories that filled in gaps in Louise's history that Maya had never known existed. "Your grandmother was remarkable," Dr. Washington told Maya, spreading old photographs across the table. "She was one of the first African American women in Charleston to own property in her own name, and she used her resources to help other families during some very difficult times." The photographs showed Louise as a young woman, confident and elegant, standing in front of buildings Maya didn't recognize and surrounded by people whose stories were now lost to time. She was also politically active in ways that were dangerous for someone in her position, Dr. Washington continued. She supported voter registration efforts, helped families facing eviction, and provided financial backing for several small businesses that couldn't get traditional bank loans. Maya began to understand that her grandmother's partnership with James's mother had been part of a larger pattern of using business success to create opportunities for others. The intimidation campaign that had driven Louise from Charleston hadn't just been about racism. It had been about stopping someone who was using her influence to challenge existing power structures. "Dr. Washington," Maya said, "would you be willing to help me document this history? I think people need to know about the women who built businesses and communities, even when it was dangerous to do so." The collaboration with Dr. Washington led to Maya's decision to create a permanent exhibit at the new restaurant location, showcasing the history of African-American entrepreneurship in Charleston. The exhibit would honor not just Louise Washington Johnson and her partnership with Eleanor Blackwood, but dozens of other business owners and community leaders whose contributions had been overlooked or forgotten. The project attracted attention from historians, civil rights organizations, and tourism officials who recognized the potential for the exhibit to become a significant cultural attraction. But it also attracted criticism from people who argued that a restaurant shouldn't become a political statement. Maya's response to such criticism had evolved significantly from her early days at Magnolia Grace. Instead of defensiveness or anger, she found herself able to engage with opposing viewpoints while remaining firm in her convictions. "History isn't political," she would say when confronted with complaints about the exhibit. "It's simply what happened. And understanding what happened helps us make better decisions about what happens next." As the fall season arrived, bringing with it the first anniversary of Maya's employment at Magnolia Grace, the restaurant prepared for its most ambitious event yet, a gala dinner celebrating the opening of the exhibit and the announcement of the new training center location. The guest list included business leaders, politicians, historians, and community activists, along with longtime customers who had supported the restaurant through its transformation. Maya felt nervous about the scale of the event, but also excited about the opportunity to showcase how much had been accomplished in just 1 year. The evening began with cocktails in the main dining room, where guests could preview some of the historical materials that would be featured in the full exhibit. Maya moved through the crowd, greeting old friends and new supporters, feeling amazed by how much her life had changed since she had first walked through Magnolia Grace's front doors. At one point during the cocktail hour, Maya found herself in conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the customer who had hesitated to accept service from her on that first difficult day. "Mrs. Johnson," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice warm in a way Maya had never heard before. "I owe you an apology for my behavior when you first started working here. I let my discomfort with change override my recognition of quality service." Maya felt a surge of emotion at the unexpected apology. "Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate you saying that. It means a great deal to me. I've learned something important this year," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "Excellence doesn't have a particular appearance. It has to do with character and commitment, qualities you've demonstrated from the very beginning." The formal dinner portion of the evening featured speakers who placed Maya's story in the context of Charleston's broader historical narrative. Washington spoke about the economic and social contributions of African-American entrepreneurs throughout the city's history. Judge Crawford talked about the importance of businesses that reflected community values rather than simply pursuing profit. And James gave a moving tribute to his mother's vision and Louise Washington Johnson's partnership in creating what Magnolia Grace had been meant to become. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she stood before the assembled guests, feeling the weight of all the stories that had brought her to this moment. She thought about her grandmother, carrying her notebook and her dreams through a world that often refused to acknowledge her worth. She thought about Eleanor Blackwood, risking everything to build a business based on inclusion rather than exclusion. And she thought about all the people in the room who had chosen to support change even when it would have been easier to maintain the status quo. "A year ago, I came to Magnolia Grace looking for a job," Maya began. "I thought success would mean proving that I belonged in a place that wasn't sure it wanted me. But I learned that belonging isn't something you earn from other people. It's something you claim for yourself by doing excellent work and treating others with respect." She paused, looking out at faces that reflected Charleston's changing demographics and evolving values. "My grandmother never got to see the full realization of her partnership with Eleanor Blackwood," Maya continued. "But she planted seeds that grew even in her absence. Tonight, we celebrate not just what we've accomplished, but what becomes possible when people choose to build bridges instead of walls." The dinner raised more than enough money to fund the new training center, but more importantly, it established Magnolia Grace as a symbol of what Charleston could become when its businesses embraced both excellence and inclusion. In the weeks following the gala, Maya found herself fielding calls from restaurant owners in other cities who wanted to learn about Magnolia Grace's transformation. She began traveling to speak at hospitality conferences and business schools, sharing the lessons she had learned about creating change in traditional industries. But the work that mattered most to Maya remained rooted in Charleston, in the daily operations of Magnolia Grace, and the development of programs that would create opportunities for others facing the same barriers she had encountered. The training center opened the following spring in a beautifully renovated building in Charleston's historic district. The The program offered full scholarships to young people from underrepresented communities, providing not just culinary training but business education, financial literacy, and mentorship opportunities. The first class of students included teenagers from Charleston's public schools, young adults aging out of foster care, and immigrants working to establish new lives in America. Maya found herself energized by their enthusiasm and challenged by their questions about navigating industries that hadn't always welcomed people who looked like them. "The restaurant business is hard," she would tell each new class during their orientation. "It requires skill, dedication, and the ability to handle pressure with grace. But it also offers the opportunity to create moments of joy for strangers, to build businesses that strengthen communities, and to prove that excellence comes in many forms." One of the students, a 17-year-old named Marcus, who had grown up in one of Charleston's most disadvantaged neighborhoods, reminded Maya of herself when she had first arrived at Magnolia Grace. "Ms. Johnson," he asked during a particularly intense training session, "how do you handle it when people don't think you belong somewhere?" Maya smiled, remembering asking similar questions during her own early days in the industry. "You focus on the work," she said. "You remember that your value doesn't depend on other people's recognition of it, and you trust that excellence has a way of speaking for itself, even when it takes time for people to listen." As Maya's second anniversary at Magnolia Grace approached, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed and how much work remained to be done. The restaurant had become more successful than ever. The training center was expanding to serve more students, and the historical exhibit had attracted visitors from around the country. But Maya also recognized that individual success, no matter how significant, was meaningful only if it created pathways for others. The real measure of what she and James had accomplished would be whether their work inspired similar transformations in other businesses and communities. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, as Maya reviewed applications for the training center's next class, she received a phone call that brought the past and present together in an unexpected way. "Ms. Johnson, this is Robert Washington," the caller said. "I think you knew my mother, Louise Washington Johnson. She was your grandmother." Maya's heart stopped as she realized she was speaking to an uncle she had never known existed. "Uncle Robert?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been following the news about what you've accomplished at Magnolia Grace," he said, "and I think it's time I shared some things about your grandmother that might help you understand why what you're doing is so important." The meeting with Uncle Robert took place at Maya's apartment on a Sunday evening, with James present at Maya's request. Uncle Robert was a retired teacher in his 70s, with the same dignified bearing that Maya remembered from her grandmother. "Your grandmother never talked about her time at Magnolia Grace after we moved to Atlanta," he began. "But she never forgot it either. She kept newspaper clippings about the restaurant, and she always believed that someday the partnership she and Eleanor Blackwood had envisioned would be restored." Uncle Robert pulled out a worn envelope that contained letters Louise had written but never sent, addressed to Eleanor Blackwood and expressing her hopes that their shared vision would eventually be realized. "She wrote these letters every year on the anniversary of the restaurant's opening," Uncle Robert explained. "I found them after she passed away, along with instructions that if any of her descendants ever had the opportunity to return to Charleston and complete what she had started, they should know they had her blessing." Maya read the letters through tears, seeing her grandmother's dreams expressed in words of forgiveness rather than bitterness, hope rather than regret. "She would be so proud of what you've accomplished," Uncle Robert said. "Not just the business success, but the way you've honored the values she tried to live by." As winter settled over Charleston once again, Maya found herself thinking often about legacy and the ways that individual choices ripple through generations. Her grandmother's partnership with Eleanor Blackwood had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control, but the values that had driven their collaboration had survived to inspire new forms of cooperation and inclusion. The annual gala for the training center had become one of Charleston's most anticipated social events, attracting support from people who recognized that investing in opportunity was the most effective way to strengthen communities. This year's event would honor the first graduates of the program, young people who were now working in restaurants throughout the region and beginning to create changes in their own workplaces. Maya stood in Magnolia Grace's kitchen on the evening before the gala, watching the staff prepare for what would be the restaurant's busiest night of the year. The team moved with the practiced coordination that came from shared purpose and mutual respect, representing the kind of workplace culture that she and James had worked to create. Tommy approached her with a plate of the evening's featured appetizer, a dish that combined traditional low-country ingredients with techniques the training center students had learned from their diverse cultural backgrounds. "Try this," he said with a grin. It's what happens when old traditions meet new possibilities. Maya tasted the dish and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with being part of something larger than herself. The gala that evening exceeded all expectations, raising enough money to expand the training center program and establish satellite programs in other cities. But for Maya, the most meaningful moment came when Marcus, the young man who had reminded her of her younger self, stood before the assembled guests to share his experience in the program. A year ago, I thought the restaurant business was just about serving food to people who had more money than my family ever did, he said. But I learned that it's really about creating experiences that bring people together and building businesses that strengthen communities. Ms. Johnson and the team at Magnolia Grace showed me that excellence isn't about where you come from. It's about where you're willing to go and who you're willing to bring with you. As the evening concluded and the last guest departed, Maya found herself alone in the dining room with James, looking out at the city lights that twinkled beyond the restaurant's windows. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your mother and my grandmother had been able to work together without interference? Maya asked. I used to, James replied, but I've come to believe that their partnership was never really broken. It was just waiting for the right time and the right people to continue what they started. Maya nodded, feeling the truth of his words in the depth of her bones. The work of building inclusive communities and businesses that served everyone was never finished, but it was work that connected each generation to the next, creating bridges across time and difference. On a warm spring morning, exactly 2 years after Maya had first walked through Magnolia Grace's front doors, she stood in the same spot where she had felt so uncertain about her place in the world. Now, as co-owner of a thriving restaurant and founder of a program that was creating opportunities for others, she felt amazed by how much could change when people chose courage over comfort. The notebook her grandmother had given her was now filled with observations, recipes, and plans for future projects. Next to it sat Eleanor Blackwood's notebook, containing the dreams and vision that had taken decades to fully realize. Together, the two books represented a legacy of partnership that had survived separation, prejudice, and time itself. Maya opened to a fresh page in her grandmother's notebook and began to write, "Today marks 2 years since I began this journey. What I thought was ending one story has turned out to be the beginning of another. The work continues, the dreams expand, and the circle of possibility grows wider with each person who chooses to join us in building something better." As she wrote, Maya could almost feel her grandmother's presence, along with Eleanor Blackwood's spirit, and the hopes of all the people who had believed that businesses could be forces for justice as well as profit. The restaurant around her hummed with the quiet energy of a place where those beliefs had become reality. The lunch service would begin soon, bringing new guests who would experience the hospitality that emerged when excellence and inclusion worked together. Some would be tourists discovering Charleston's evolving food scene. Others would be locals celebrating special occasions or conducting business meetings. And some would be young people inspired by the example of what became possible when someone refused to accept that their dreams were too big for the spaces that had been prepared for them. Maya closed the notebook and stood, ready to begin another day of the work that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. Outside, Charleston awakened to possibilities that hadn't existed when she first arrived at Magnolia Grace, carrying nothing but determination, and her grandmother's belief that excellence could not be contained by the prejudices of those too small to recognize it. The restaurant doors would open soon, welcoming everyone who came seeking not just a meal, but an experience of what the world could look like when people chose to build bridges instead of walls. And Maya Johnson, granddaughter of Louise Washington Johnson, partner of James Blackwood, and heir to a legacy of courage and vision, would be there to welcome them all.